So, hello all, and welcome to another episode on Design to Connect podcast. We are in season 2, so that means we are connecting with individuals who are using design to make a positive impact, reduce inequalities, and contribute to the SDGs. And our today's guest is someone who I've been following his work on LinkedIn for a while, and I can tell that he's been involved in some really interesting projects. He's among thousands of other things, one of the co-founders of Poor Collective, which stands for Power Out of Restrictions. We're connecting with him from London now. Am I okay? And his name is Shawn Adams. Hi, Shawn. How are you?
Thanks for having me.
Great. Great to have you here. So I'm going to give a little intro of who you are to our listeners, and then we jump into the questions. So Shawn, you are an architect, writer, and lecturer. You currently teach Bachelor of Architecture. Your master's degree final year design project, Plinths and Tapestry, has been featured in Financial Times, The Guardian, and was the winner of 2020 Architects Journal Postgraduate Student Prize. Previously, and as an architectural writer, you've written for Financial Times, Wallpaper, The Architects Journal, RIBAJ Journal, Icon, Frame, The Guardian, and a lot of other places. You're also a trustee of the Museum of Architecture and an advisory board member of Open Cities Accelerate program. You're an advocate for diversity and inclusion within the architecture industry, which is really something that is really needed. And you're also, as I mentioned before, one of the co-founders of Poor Collective, which is a social enterprise focusing on the development of communities through the elevation of young people. That's a lot of work for 3 years. I'm so happy to have you here. And yeah, welcome.
Thank you.
So normally this is not the first question that I ask people, but reading your bio made me curious to know a little bit about your master project's work. I wanted to hear from your point of view. Why do you think, what was in that work that led it to be featured in like so many different magazines and also to win an award?
I think for my project Plinths and Tapestry, I think the difference between that project and a lot of the student projects that I was seeing at the time was that I wasn't looking to create something really glamorous or something really shiny or something that's immediately quite striking. I was trying to create something that sensitively thinks about the local community,
Mhm.
and then the architecture comes from that, because I think a lot of students often, I see it with my own students, often want to create something that's like really quite cool, something really quite architecturally interesting or visually intriguing, but
Mhm.
they don't spend the time to try and understand who's the client or who's the local community that the project is serving, what is going to be the impact of the project. And I think for my project, that was some of the key aspects of the project. So learning from the community. So the project was situated in Agbo Blushi, which is now being kind of eradicated. But at the time, it was a e-waste graveyard,
Okay.
and it was looking at the link between how we treat electronics in the Western world and how they're disposed of in the global South. But then looking at how communities in the global South utilize these electronics and don't simply throw them away. So there's a lot of things that we can actually learn from the Western world about how we can use, reuse, and kind of reinvent technologies, items, materials that we more often than not throw away. And I
Mhm.
think that kind of sensitivity was what allowed me to create spaces that were using these materials, that used the local skills, that started to bring together the culture in the area and in the wider context. And I
Mhm.
think having that as a foundation and setting that as a firm foundation, I think once the project was kind of in full flow and I started thinking about the design, I just believed that it made everything a bit more meaningful. and genuine. And I think that's the thing, when you interrogate my project in more detail, you notice. Because I think another thing is that in the project, I don't have these massive renders where you're seeing the whole, like you're not seeing the entire design. And that was something that was a conscious decision, because I could have done these really like massive renders that showed all of this kind of material waste, but it was really down to the details. So how do these materials come together? How do these components work together? What would the detail of it look? And I think in every instance, my approach was slightly different, but it wasn't different for the sake of being different. It
Mm.
was different because it was like, how do I show the information that I need to show in the most clearest and coherent way? And I guess luckily the people that saw my project, they quickly understood what I was trying to do, and they were quite impressed by that. And I think that kind of goes to show that there is a desire for you not to have like the super shiny, massive drawings. Don't get me wrong, I think the drawings that I produced are really quite beautiful, but they may not be the ones that are immediately eye catching. But I think that kind of shows you, and that's a testament to the project itself, the context, the critical thinking behind it, all contributes to being a project that is award winning.
That's great. Yeah, I think some changes are slowly happening, especially in the education. Then in the profession, we are still a little bit more behind. I mean, people individually, they're trying to work on more impactful designs and like have a deeper critical thinking on what they are designing and why they are designing. But yeah, we're slowly getting there. But yeah, I think you winning this award also gives some hope for more impactful projects in the future. So if we want to go a little bit deeper, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your personal journey.
Mm.
And do you hear the ambulance here?
Yeah, barely. It's not too loud.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, because Italian ambulances are pretty loud. So yeah, I wanted to ask you about your personal journey, and especially as it relates to your work with young people in Poor Collective. I wanted to know what was in your journey that made you think that empowering young people or giving them voices is a necessary or important work to do. If that goes back to anything that you have experienced personally, I would love to hear about it.
So when I was growing up, I didn't really have access to anyone that was doing any creative subjects. So
Mhm.
I say creative, or design related subjects. So architecture, furniture design, industrial design, graphic design, a lot of creative subjects in the design field, and I didn't have any access to. And always knew I wanted to become an architect. So that was something that I was actively working towards. But during my journey to becoming an architect, especially the early years, I didn't have any architects that I could speak to. I didn't know any architects. So it was quite hard for me to know where I go next. And luckily I was very passionate about architecture, and I knew I wanted to become an architect. But I think for many young people, they have an interest or they have a passion, but they don't know where they can put their energy. Because if
Mhm.
you can't see what you're trying to become, it's very difficult to envision yourself getting there. And for me, that's something that's super important. So because I didn't have an architect that I could go to or speak to, or give me some guidance or help me before I got to university, is super important for me. And this is also the rest of the poor team, that we provide opportunities for young people to meet architects, to meet designers, be presented with design opportunities. Because if we're able to inform them, we could give them insight into what it's like to become a designer. But also for the students that don't necessarily think they want to become designers,
Mhm.
they may attend a workshop, or we may come into their school, or we may do something creative with them. And now we've opened their eyes to creative subjects, something that they were completely unaware of. Because when I was at school, it was mainly you'd either go to university and study a degree, which will probably be like law or medicine,
Mhm.
or you could go straight into work,
Yeah.
or you could either do sports or music. So when in terms of options or career options, it wasn't as if I knew about all of these design careers. I didn't know anything about design career. I didn't know what subjects you would even study to get into a design career. I think for each of us important, it's super important that we kind of go into these communities, speak to young people, and try and inspire them.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I feel like right now there's a lot of talk about the inclusion of young people, especially let's say in the policy environment. And some steps are being taken. I'm not saying that nothing is being done, but still a lot of this inclusion is performative. But the way that I see that you work with Pro Collective is I feel that you're really valuing young people and you're trying to connect with them in a deeper level and really uh, yeah hear them instead of just have them around let's say so why I think you a little bit talked about that before, but why do you think this is an important job to be done or a necessary job to be done?
So one of the main reasons is just the length of time that architecture takes and how long buildings take to be built. So
Hmm.
a lot of the time architects are talking about, let's say housing, for example, developing housing in an area. Housing could take, depending on the development, it could take decades. So if you have young people that are living in a particular area, when
Hmm.
a development's done, they may actually be the adults of the area. They're the people that run businesses. They're the people that live in the area. They're the people that have families in the area. So a lot of the time, the people that are living there already, they may not be at the forefront of the community after the development is done. So a lot of the time, it's the young people that then inherit that part of the city. And for us, it's super important that this is acknowledged because these are the people that are going to be in these communities. And if we're truly designing cities for people, we need to consider the next generation. I think what's also important to mention is that you have lived experiences. You have young people that have lived and grown up in the area, and their lived experiences are just as valuable as anyone else's. And to ignore those their lived experiences, I think you're not going to be able to truly and genuinely design and build architecture that speaks to a community. So for us, it's super important that you listen to the younger generation because they've got a lot of insight and they're experts in their own experience. We, as architects and designers, we can go into places and we can come up with ideas and designs for the area. But if we're not listening to the local people, the local residents, how genuine is that design going to be?
Mhm.
And for that, for us, this is super important that we listen to local communities, we listen to the younger generation, and I think that's how you create architecture and design that people are genuinely invested in. Because a lot of the time you see when local communities aren't engaged, you might create something that looks really beautiful on the outside, but inside it has a lot of problems because people aren't interested in leaving and coming and being in the spaces because they're spaces that they didn't want. So for us, we see it as being incredibly valuable, and rightfully so. We're seeing an increase in policy, increase of competitions, having percentages for community engagement, social value, and rightfully so because developments can't be like completely destroying communities and then claiming that they are there for the people.
Mhm. Yeah, that's true. And I think there's a need for a mindset shift around participation and taking a space, because I think still how we see participation or like yeah again taking a space is as a way to hold power instead of seeing it as a way that we can actually improve as a society. So I think until we don't yeah in all of our minds we don't have that mindset shift, always participation can create fears in some groups within the society, because they think if somebody else is taking a space or if somebody else is talking and saying their opinions, they might not have a space to share their opinions anymore. So
Exactly.
Yeah, I guess that's a part of it also. Something else that I wanted to talk to you about is the view that like exists towards young people. I feel there is a negative perception towards youth, especially towards Gen Z. And they are often seen as lazy people, that they don't want to work for what they want to achieve. Um, and I think this, let's say, negative perception towards young people has existed for a couple of decades now, and the media has always also kind of amplified this idea of, for example, we always heard in the movies, I think when I was growing up, like young and stupid, these kind of phrases. Um, but I like personally, I have a younger sister. She's 17 years old, and I don't see that in her. And also with the things that happened in the past couple of months in Iran, because I'm Iranian, and seeing the youngest people being, you know, uh, yeah, in the front row for creating a change, I feel that uh, young people are full of ambition, full of sense of justice, full of bravery, and they have this ability to question what maybe we are already getting used to, so I said all that to ask you about your experience working with young people, and like how has maybe your view changed towards youth as you have worked with them? Did you have some prejudices before, or have you always thought that young people are full of power and they can create change? How has that experience been for you?
I think when I was young, for example, I always thought that I had good ideas and I always thought that I could make a change, but a lot of the time I just wasn't given the platform to make that change. And I've seen it like in the early stages of my professional career, I would have a good idea, but because I'm so junior in my role, the idea isn't taken seriously. But then I'd see someone more senior say the
Mm,
same thing, and then everyone's kind of clapping and raising their hands because it's such a great idea. So I've always thought that my ideas and my way of thinking it has value, and kind of growing up, I was always kind of told that yeah, your voice has like it has weight and it has importance, but just wasn't really given that platform. And I think there's a lot of young people in the same position. They are really quite critical thinkers and they're thinking outside the box, or because they haven't had certain experiences yet,
yeah.
they're thinking slightly differently to adults that have maybe had a certain experience. Because I think a lot of the time adults always say to young people, oh, like you can't do this or you shouldn't do this because I've had this experience.
Mm,
But I think one of the problems is if you're kind of trying to put someone off because you've had a certain experience, you don't know if they're going to have that same experience. They may actually have a slightly different experience, or the way they may actually go about doing things may be completely different because times are always changing. And I think you're completely correct. We're seeing, if we even look at the climate crisis, for example,
mm,
some of the people that are fighting the most for the climate crisis are young people.
yeah.
And we're increasingly seeing it, young people protesting, young people standing up for what they think is right, young people voicing their opinions. In this technological age, young people are using technology to voice their opinions, communicate with others. So I think is a bit dismissive to say young people don't have enough knowledge or expertise or life experience to kind of inform things, because there's a lot of young people that are doing really great work. Obviously, there may be a lot of young people that are immature or seem to kind of mess around, but I think at the same time you need to tap into their interests, because a lot of the time, from my experience of work with young people may not be interested because you're not tapping into their interests. And I could give several examples of where we've gone and done workshops and the young people aren't really interested because it's quite arbitrary. But then when we start to relate it back to their experiences,
Mm,
things that they're doing day to day, soft like apps that they're using, software that they're familiar with, then we start getting better engagement. So I think it is
mm,
about understanding what is interesting to students. Because if you're trying to get information about developments from students and you're showing them some 16th century architecture, they may not be interested. But if you're here showing them the latest architecture in some of the most interesting countries that they want to visit, maybe you get a bit more out of them. So I think it's also knowing your audience in the same way. If you're an architect and you're designing for a specific community, you need to know what that community are interested in to
Mm.
get the most out of them.
Yeah, that's true. And how has like this learning environment have been for you? Like, do you feel that you're also learning from young people when you're working with them? Like, do you feel there's a mutual learning environment? How is that? Let's say,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think if any creative or designer should always be learning, and they should be always learning from fresh minds.
Mm,
And I've a lot of ideas and kind of more fresh ideas come from younger minds, because I think whilst a lot of older designers have clearly got loads of experience and may know how the industry works, I think when you're much younger, there's this kind of sense of quote unquote naivety, or you've got these big ideas, and because
mm,
you may not have any responsibilities or you may not know how things work, you're usually quite ambitious, and you'll be like, you know what, I'm gonna change the world, or I'm gonna do this, or I'm gonna do this. But a lot of the time, as you get older, you become a bit more jaded. Like, people become a bit more cynical. They're like, oh, this can't happen because of this. But I think a lot of young people are quite positive. They're quite positive, and they're willing to use their energy to try and fight for things. And I think there's always things that you can learn from young people. And it's quite funny, because I think one of the things that we're seeing now is like how TikTok's being used and how loads of young people are using TikTok, and we're seeing older people now trying to use TikTok and use these social media platforms to try and communicate with other people and communicate with young people.
mhm,
Now, this is a perfect example of seeing how loads of companies, businesses, organizations are now having to learn from young people. We're seeing organizations like Transport for London getting young people to create videos so
mm,
that a broader demographic of people can engage with their content. Or we're seeing brands and organizations that we would have never imagined work with very young teenagers, and they're creating videos to try and get people engaged. Like, one video that I've seen, there's a guy on TikTok that does science videos. He's in his 20s, but instead of having like a senior science teacher go over all of these kind of things on the periodic table, because
mhm.
he's much younger and much more quirky, they're getting loads of young people interested in science. So it's things like this. So how can young people help to kind of promote, platform, and contribute? And I think this is something that we should be thinking about more, because these young creative minds can help us think about the future.
That's true. That's very true. And like, um, but something that I'm worried about, and I've been thinking, I've been talking to one of my friends about this, is that now how can we not make young people only uh, taking the responsibility of the digital things that maybe the older generation are unable to do? You know, how can we make sure that their ideas are also heard? Maybe not only related to technology and how, you know, to disseminate the idea, but also, you know, as a general term. So it's a, I think it's a difficult balance not to only use young people for the digital platform and for you know, for their ability in social media and all that thing, but also to hear their voices about what should be done for the community in the cities, in the society. So yeah, I think we kind of have to find a balance there.
No,
Um,
I totally agree.
yeah, but something else that I wanted to ask you about is if you've seen like any change in the way that the youth that you worked with in how they act as you have worked with them, because I feel that people act a lot of times like as a reaction of how we see them. And I think if you start valuing young people and listen to them, maybe the troublemaker of the group becomes the one that is problem solving the most, and things like that can happen with just a different perception towards youth. So I wanted to ask you if you have experienced that, if you've seen an impact in how the youth show up through these projects and as you go on through a project.
Yeah, I think with the work that we do at Poor, for us, is not only about working with young people, it's about empowering, upskilling, and providing them with the skills and the tools to make a change and voice their opinions, but also to make an impact. So
Mhm.
when we're working with young people, we often see them grow professionally and personally. We usually see them going from maybe a bit quiet, a bit timid, to being much more eloquent, being confident to speak to others, and being confident in voicing their own opinion. And I think that's something that's really quite important, because upskilling and teaching and actually explaining to young people why you're doing something and why it's important can make a big difference. So you mentioned about the student that may be a bit disruptive, or maybe kind of a bit of a troublemaker in the class, but if you're explaining to that young person, this is what you can do with this thing, or
Mhm.
these skills that you have and the importance of that, I think it can, even if they are still disruptive, eventually they'll come around and begin to understand why they're doing things. And I think this is, if you look at schooling systems, why we have learning objectives and learning outcomes, and even in a higher education, why we have the learning outcomes, because and I've seen this quite a lot. When you explain, this is what you'll be learning, and this is why you're learning this, and this is where these skills can take you,
Mhm.
it makes much more of a difference than just saying, okay, we're going to learn this. And you see it all the time when students are like, oh, why do we need to learn about this, or why do we need to learn about
Mhm.
this? Because they don't understand the real life applications of the thing that they're learning. But when you're quite clear and you say, well, in the future, if you want to have your own company, you
Mhm.
need to be good at time management. You need to be good at speaking. You need to be good at communication. You need to have good writing skills. And then when we're doing these activities, and they're like, "Yeah, I want to have my own business, or I want to have my own fashion brand, or I want to design trainers." Then they start to pay more attention, because they see that, and they start to realize, okay, there's a real life application to the things that I'm learning. And I think that's something that I would say for other people that are working with young people is not about just kind of working with them, is explaining to them, this is what you'll be learning if you engage with what we're trying to show you.
True, that's true. And yeah, and also yeah, as a continue to what you were saying, I wanted to ask you a little bit about like design and impact, and I think you talked about this a little bit when you were talking about your project, your master's degree project. Something that I wish that I knew earlier, even before starting architectural school, was to know about the power of design and what it can truly do in addressing, let's say, inequalities or creating, let's say, positive impact somehow. And um, I wanted to ask you about how and if you're trying to transfer such concepts to young people as you're talking to them about design. Because I feel my generation was, and our education was a lot focused on educating kind of archistars, even if they were not calling them archistars, but the mindset was that, and the impact and the why behind the design and what design can actually do in the society was not very much the main focus of the education. And yeah, as far as you're doing some educational workshops, and you I saw that you've had some resources also on your website. uh, I want to ask you a little bit about the thinking behind
Mm.
those creating those workshops, and if you're trying to like yeah put such kind of ideas. as you're designing those workshops?
I think in the time that we're at with the kind of architectural canon, I think now we're moving from a time where people are making kind of like these egotistical buildings and moving more towards architecture that is more socially minded. We're
Mm-hmm.
seeing a lot of designers move from making physical structures to making structures that may be frameworks, that could be policy,
Yeah.
it could be small scale interventions. So I think architecture with a capital A is changing. We're seeing architects that are using their skills in completely different ways to really serve communities. And I think if we're talking about architecture and architects building for people, because that's the kind of the, the real premise of architecture. You're designing spaces for other humans. I think we need to really go back to basics and understand what are the social, economic, political,
Mm.
cultural, like social aspects of whatever you're designing. And I think each of the best architects, these are all things that they're considering what is happening at the time. Like even when in architecture education, when you're writing an essay, you're not just writing an essay based on a particular building. You're writing about what the political landscape at the time. How did that impact the society? Like historically, what was happening? These are all things that now I think we're seeing designers focus on straight away and not only want to make something that is like, okay, this is going to be a really beautiful building that's going to be on the cover of all the magazines. And I think why this is super important now, because we're seeing it in the top design schools. We're seeing at the Architectural Association, at St. Martin, at the Royal College of Art, like these top schools in London. We're seeing it's not about what does the final product look like. It's what is the impact of what you're designing. And that again can mean that maybe you're not even designing a building at all.
Yeah.
Maybe you're an architect, but you're not designing a building. I think the direction that architecture is moving in, this is super important. And again, if we start to think about the climate crisis, if we
Mm-hmm.
start to think of embodied carbon, the cost and the implications to the environment in demolishing buildings unnecessarily instead of retrofitting, we're seeing in some instances the best types of architecture is using what is existing
Mm-hmm.
and redeveloping that as opposed to just simply destroying. And I think this is where there's a change, because I think a lot of people assume that architecture is creating something that's new and shiny, but in fact, it doesn't necessarily have to be this new and shiny thing. It can be something more ad hoc, and I think that's something that you could kind of see in my project. Something that's ad hoc, that's using existing resources
Mm-hmm.
and playing on how they can be used, because another thing that we can't ignore is the cost of architecture. If we're talking about marginalized communities and some of the most vulnerable people in society, they may not have this endless budget that a rich client has to make a multi-million pound house. So we've got to think about how can we make an impact at an affordable cost as well, or how can it make sense, or how can we get funding? So there's so many ways now that designers are thinking about ways of developing architecture that isn't the traditional and conventional way. And I think in a way this is much better, and I think it's allowing people to think more critically. And what we're seeing as a result is we're seeing architects working with scientists, anthropologists, and the profession is becoming much more multidisciplinary.
Yeah.
I think this is super important because it's now giving architects more importance in society. So I think this is definitely something that we kind of need to continue doing. And going back to your question of the young people and bringing the kind of young people in, for us, this is something that's super important. It's not just about creating these kind of like random forms or shapes that may look nice. Is about what is this doing for the local community? Who is it serving, and what is its impact?
Mm. Thank you. And and what was how the young people react to ideas like that, and like how do you think they feel when they see that they are creating a positive impact in their
And
environment?
the young people are proud. Like one of our projects, Bringing Home to the Unknown,
Mm,
we started working with young people from Maidbrook Park School that knew nothing about architecture. They didn't know what architects did. They weren't interested in any design related courses. But in the end, after co-designing a pavilion with them, they were really proud because it spoke to their local community. It spoke to their idea of dwelling in central London. And I think a lot of people assume some of these concepts may be too complicated, but I don't think so. I think like once you start to understand young people and give them the time and give them a platform, you start to come up with concepts that you hadn't imagined.
mm,
And the end result is something that they're usually quite proud of when you've carefully considered what they actually want.
mm. Thank you. And also, I saw that you created a manifesto. Can you a little bit explain about that, the points that are inside that, and why did you feel the need for creating that?
So that's actually our second manifesto. And I think for us, it's important to have a manifesto so that we we always go back to the manifesto. So we have the manifesto, we also have a vision, and we also have a mission. So these are kind of the three pillars that ground the work that we do. Because I think with any organization, it's super important that you know why you're doing the work, who you're serving, and what you're trying to achieve in the future. And I think the manifesto kind of sets out what we're trying to do, how we're trying to empower young people, and what skills we're hoping to develop with them so that we can platform their voices. And I think that manifesto helps us with when we're picking projects, when we're invited to on projects, when we're kind of work with other people, just to always keep our work grounded, because at the crux of our organization is working with young people and empowering them. And with every project that we do, we have to remember that, because there may be opportunities where we're
Mm,
doing work that's slightly different. That's not to say that we don't take the project, but we then have to go back through our manifesto and think about what is it that we're trying to achieve in their project. Can
mm,
we empower young people? Can we upskill them? Can we create a platform for them? If not, maybe this might not be the right project for us. And it's really something that we go back to and keep kind of reminding ourselves of. With that being said, I think the manifesto can also change, because before we had a much longer 10-point manifesto, but we wanted to condense it and be a bit more critical. And I think it's similar to business strategies, like every few years, looking at
mm,
your business and then reflecting, is this still what we're doing? Are
mm,
moved in a slightly different direction? Are we doing things slightly different? That's not to say that the manifesto will massively change, but it's redefining it, reinterpreting it based on the work that we've been doing.
mm. That's great. And before I go to the last question, I wanted to ask you something that I'm personally curious about. Uh, in your LinkedIn bio, you wrote that you are trying to work for the diversity and inclusion in the industry, and I'm just curious to know some of the things that you've been doing and how you're trying to carry that.
Mm. So Wallpaper is a socially minded organization, and we work with young people. I
Mm,
have a particular um, interest and passion for upskilling and providing opportunities for the marginalized, in architecture, especially the ethnic minorities and some of the most vulnerable communities, because within architecture, and again, it goes back to each of us growing up from working class backgrounds. Architecture is a very elitist profession,
mhm,
super elitist, and we see it all the time. Some of the most wealthiest people designing buildings for some of the poorest people in society and just not understanding the issues that they face. And I think for us, it's super important that ethnic minorities, for example, get the opportunities to design and inform their own spaces. because they're the people that have the lived experiences. They're the people that really understand the space. Getting someone that's from a completely different class, different completely different world essentially to design their spaces can be damaging at times if they don't spend the time to really engage and consult the community. So for us, we've always tried to be quite open and saying like we've had many financial barriers. Me personally, when getting into the RCA, for example, I needed to get 2 scholarships, but going to the RCA, I knew that would help me get a more critical understanding of architecture. So for us, it's always about how can we provide opportunities? How can we make the industry more inclusive? How can we make architecture more inclusive? How can we provide opportunities for people that wouldn't typically get opportunities? Like, how can we make the profession more diverse? And that is something that kind of goes to the crux of our organization. And when we're working with different organizations and different people, we're also always thinking about how can we try and be inclusive? Like, how can we provide opportunities for people again that wouldn't typically get opportunities? And I think that's a lot of the time how we end up picking the people on some of our programs. So, for example, Chloe on the Build the Way program, she had financial barriers going into architecture. So she wanted to become an architect, but she couldn't. And it's no secret that there's a lack of black females in the architecture profession. So for us, when she was showing this desire and she applied for the Build the Way internship, we looked at all of these things, and for us, this was super important. There were people that may have been more talented than Chloe.
Mm-hmm.
For us, it was about she shows a willingness, she's passionate, and there's already quite a few barriers and hurdles that are stopping her from getting to where she wants to be. So how can we try and help and support her? Because if she wasn't to get this opportunity, would there be another opportunity that she'll be able to get? And these are things that we're always considering. So for the Make as a Mentor program, for example, Alejandro is a similar story. He had financial barriers and he wanted to get into architecture, but he was struggling. So for us, it's about how do we support these people? Because again, there's always going to be students that are more talented, have more resource, have come from a quite wealthy family. But for us, it's about the students that are passionate but may not come from a wealthy family or may not necessarily get an opportunity. How can we help those students?
Yeah.
And I think myself and Larry, we were quite fortunate because when we were going through our architectural studies, we were part of the Stephen Lawrence Charitable Trust. And at the time, the trust had a program called the Building Futures Program, and it was helping ethnic minorities get into architecture.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was super super useful because there was workshops where you would learn how to public speak, how to conduct yourself, how to communicate well. And I think that is a way that we can open up the profession, because if we can provide more access, then we will see much more interesting, critical, and impactful architecture and design, because we're getting a broad range of people from diverse backgrounds contributing instead of it being one specific demographic that it seems to currently be.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And as you say, those are the voices that we are actually, I mean, the ones who are not, they don't have the, maybe, yeah, the financial resources, or let's say the political, like there's not a political structure for supporting them to enter universities, are exactly the voices that we are missing from the industry. And maybe, yeah, a lot of the issues that we are facing now in the, yeah, environmentally and socially is because that we are missing those voices uh, in the industry. So yeah, that's great what you're doing. Um, this has been great, but I think because of the time, we have to wrap up. I wanted to ask you one more question. Um, and yeah, it's about our listeners. How can they, whether they're a designer or not, they are in architecture, in urban design or not, how can they if they're interested in doing community activities with youth, how can they start that maybe in their neighborhood? If you have any suggestions, or if you know of any initiatives, of course there's yours. Any other initiatives that they could volunteer with, they could work with, and any suggestions on that end?
I think the first thing is to get started and have, if you have an idea, plan out the idea. I think a lot of people become quite hesitant because they're like, "Oh, I don't know if I can actually execute this. I don't know what I need to do." I think the first thing is having the idea and then working out how you execute it after, because for example, when we started this, when I was still in my first year of university, it takes time for organizations or initiatives or programs to come together. Some of our programs have been 2 years in the making, 1-2 years to develop the program. But it's about getting the program right, is putting it together. If you've got an idea, putting it together and not rushing it, because a lot of the time people look at things and think, oh, they just came up with this or they came up with that, but they don't understand that it took a lot of conversations, a lot of meetings, a lot of planning to actually to build these things. So I think that's something to think about, like being patient, but also being quite methodical in terms of what is it that you're trying to achieve. If you know you have a local basketball court that needs uplifting and you want your community to come together and paint it, or you want to paint a mural in your area, is thinking about the steps. How do you go about doing that? So do you have a strategy for how you're going to get young people involved? Are you going to do flyers, posters? Have you got contacts in your local area? Do you know local decision makers that could help you with this? Is there funding in your local area? Like, it's super important that you do your research before you embark in any project. And it's similar to building projects, where the foundations can take quite a lot of time to get right, but then once the foundations are set, the building goes up quite quickly. And it's the same if you're wanting to work with your local community or young people. You need to set those foundations, get your concept, your idea, plan everything out, do your research, contact the right people, and then once you've got that all sorted, the projects will get done quite quickly. And the third project's often the one that's quite difficult. But once you get that third project, then more projects will eventually come. But then again, that's why I'm saying you really got to plan out what you're doing, because if you plan it out well and people see that you work well, then there may be other opportunities in the future. So I think one of the main things is really planning and doing your research. And then I would say the next thing is really just make sure you do the job properly. I think there's a lot of transferable skills here, like communication, time management, like being professional, being understanding. All of these things kind of contribute to being able to do this work with like local communities and young people. But I think the other thing I would kind of mention, and kind of to answer to bookend the question, is really having an identity. So what is that identity? Because if you're trying to approach people, you don't really want to be approaching people as I got a random idea. It's like what is it? Is it a one-off initiative? Are you making a company now? Or like what is it that you're actually trying to do? Because if you've got a name, you've got a mission, a vision, a manifesto, you've got all of these things quite clear, it'll be easy to communicate what you're trying to do to people. Like maybe you want to create a one-off mural. Could that mural have a name? Could that mural have a specific graphic design to it? Could you make an Instagram page? It's just about having all of these things so people can actually find out and learn a bit more about what it is that you're trying to do. And if you have that, I think it just makes it much more easier, because you could go around and say, I want to paint a mural, I want to do community work in my area. But what are you showing people for them to buy into that community work that you're trying to do? Like, even if you don't have previous experience, like, is there things that you could put together? Can you show them, okay, I've got my architecture portfolio, I previously did painting, or I've got interest in this. It's about putting everything together. And I think, especially for the designers, thinking about proposals. Like, not all proposals have to be a building proposal. If you know you want to do a community project, put together a clear proposal and then start reaching out to people, asking them, "Oh, can I speak to you for or
Mm,
half an hour, or could I have a quick chat with you during a lunch break?" Put together a proposal, because there's one thing to say you want to do something, but if people could see that you've got a proposal, you thought about the budget, you thought about the
mm,
time, you thought about how many workshops you're going to deliver, uh, and like the timeline. You thought about all these things. People are going to take you much more serious. So I think making sure that everything is really well considered will help you to get these projects going. Because I think once you get that first project, more will come, but that first one really needs to get done well.
sure. Thank you so much, Shawn. Thanks a lot. Anything else that you want to share before close the call?
Yeah, I think that the last thing I'd like to say is, if you've got an idea or you've got a concept or there's something that you want to do, you really just have to go for it. Like, a lot of the time, people have ideas, but they're a bit skeptical about if the idea will be good, or what people might think, or if it will be a success. But don't let these things hold you back. If you know you've got a good idea, try and look for like-minded people, in the same way that me, Ben, Larry, and Matt came together. Look for people that have similar interests, that are interested in the same thing that you are interested in, but also are kind of hardworking, like very professional, like good time management, because they can really help and elevate what your idea is. And you always see it. The people that are really successful, they have an amazing team around them.
Mm,
They have people that are very supportive and help them. So I would say, yeah, if you've got an idea, like like don't kind of just sit on the idea. And if you can find people that have a similar idea, or similar concept, really stick with them, because that could really help you to grow your idea into something that's tangible.
it's true. Thank you so much. Great, great
Yeah.
finish of the talk. Yeah, you can follow Shawn on LinkedIn and his website, and also you can follow Poor Collective. They are doing really, really interesting work. And if you like what you heard, you can follow Design to Connect on YouTube, Spotify, LinkedIn, Instagram, and a lot of other channels. So thank you again, Shawn. It was great to talk to you. And yeah, thanks again.
Thanks for having me.